Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Woe. So today we are back on the Project Poirot train. Choo-choo. I really appreciate everyone's understanding and patience as I needed to take a few weeks off just because, yeah, doing these videos takes some work, and hopefully I'm filming this before I've taken my certification exam, but God willing, I've gotten that fucking thing behind me and I don't have to worry about it anymore. So appreciate your patience, and we're diving back in this week with Sad Cypress by Agatha Christie, featuring none other than Hercule Poirot, though not nearly as much as I would like, and we will get to that. So if you've never watched one of these videos before, just for context, I don't do spoilers. I usually go roundabouts to when we find a body, and then, you know, Hercule Poirot is going to figure it out because this is an Agatha Christie story / a mystery, and that's what happens. And I will be talking about character details, so if you consider that to be in any way diminishing your enjoyment of the book pre-reading it, be advised. But other than that, I think you can watch these and still read the book and not be too spoiled for anything. So I'm not going to do much of a plot synopsis today, but we'll go ahead and dive into that. So like I said, not going to do too much of a synopsis. I've struggled trying to figure out the right way to try to summarize this. I usually kind of take my cues from summarizing from a few different books that I read as research as a part of this project. In this case, they all kind of had a different approach in terms of how they were summarizing. So I think what I'm going to do is just kind of tell you guys what the structure is, what the overall kind of mystery structure is, and then a little bit about some of the characters. So this is a book that's divided essentially into 3 parts, and then also a prologue. So in the prologue, we are kind of in the point of view of Eleanor Carlisle, who is on trial for murder of someone. So that's sort of the setup. And then there's 3 different chunks of the book. So the first chunk is Eleanor, who is on trial later, and her basically fiance, Roddy Wellham. Their name is Wellham, right? Wellham? Yeah. No, Wellman. That's what it is. Roddy Wellman, who is her cousin. Gross. Though I think only by marriage. I don't think they actually have DNA that could create mutant children. They are informally engaged, and they kind of get word that their mutual aunt, who they both understand is going to leave them her fortune when she dies, has somebody who's like ingratiating themselves to her, and that they better go check it out. So that's sort of the setup. They go up to see said aunt, Mrs. Wellman, and that's the first chunk. The middle chunk is Hercule Poirot getting called in, because in the first chunk, people die. And so Hercule Poirot comes in the middle chunk, and then the final chunk is joining back at the trial, which in prologue you find out is Eleanor. So we come back to Eleanor's trial in the last chunk and get a resolution. So that's sort of the setup of the book. And then major characters, I mentioned Roddy and Eleanor. Eleanor is like clearly my favorite in this book. Then we also have Mary Gerard, who is sort of the one who is people are saying is ingratiating herself to Mrs. Wellman. She's the daughter of the lodge keeper on the properties. I think it's called, I don't remember what the house is called. I do remember that in town there's a cafe called the Blue Tit. I remember that. But anyway, so there's Mary Gerard, there's Dr. Lord, who is Mrs. Wellman's doctor, and he kind of is the one who calls Hercule Poirot in eventually. There's some housekeeper, I think Mrs. Hunterford, that sounds right. And then a couple of nurses who are on the scene because of Mrs. Wellman. She's been known to have several strokes over the last few years. So there's Nurse O'Brien and Nurse Hopkins, who are kind of around. And then some servants, a couple other, Mary Gerard's parents, a few other people like that. But it's not that big of a cast, and there's actually quite a few, there's a lot of servants in this particular cast, which is somewhat unusual for Agatha Christie. So with all that in mind, let's get into some thoughts about the book itself. This book I struggle with figuring out how to talk about, just because on a personal level, I don't particularly enjoy this book. I think that it's not playing to her strengths. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the romance part, and if you guys have seen my decluttering or unhauling of The Burden by Agatha Christie, which is her attempt at a romance, and I just don't think that's really her strong suit. I think it gets a little maudlin, and the motivation doesn't feel quite right to me. So this is as kind of almost as much a love story as it is a detective novel, and I just don't love that. That being said, I think the actual like detective part of this works pretty well. What Agatha Christie said about this novel, and when I read this I was like, yes, this is exactly right, is that why was Hercule Poirot in this novel? She basically, I think, looked back and realized that this probably should have been a Miss Marple novel, not an Hercule Poirot novel, though at this point in her career she hadn't really used Miss Marple much, so I think that's why essentially she didn't choose to do that. And maybe that plays into why I personally don't connect with this novel that much, because I tend to much prefer the Poirot novels over the Marple novels. So for me, this is not that enjoyable. The other piece of this is Hercule Poirot doesn't come into this novel until more than halfway through. So like, I don't like that it takes so long for him to show up. He doesn't have kind of like any kind of Watson type character, so he doesn't have Hastings, he doesn't have like Dr. Shepard in Murder of Roger Ackroyd. The closest thing he has is Dr. Lord, but that's not really his function in the novel. So I think for me as a Poirot, like I'm crystallizing my thoughts now, as a Poirot novel this just doesn't work that well. As a love story this doesn't work that well. As a detective story there's like a solid mystery in here, though I would be surprised if anybody guesses who did it or how. All that's, or maybe how, but like why. That piece of it I think was pretty obscure. Not in a way that felt like a cheat, but not in a way, but it's not a story that I think you could have probably guessed what was gonna happen. So anyway, all that to say, my personal feelings on it are that I don't love it. In terms of thinking about it a little bit more critically, I think some interesting things that pop up in here. As a side note, I think it's really cute because Poirot, like trying to ingratiate himself to the housekeeper, has like this little scene where they're chatting and gossiping about the royal family, and they're gossiping about who now Queen Elizabeth II might marry, and she's been married to Prince Philip for like a century basically. So I thought that was kind of a sweet little like, oh, they hadn't gotten together yet. That's a sweet little sign of the times. So that's just in terms of like the historical context, really some of the only kind of like historical details we get, especially considering this book was published in 1940, it's set in 1939, and that is like a very momentous point in history, so it's kind of interesting that we don't have more about that. And actually the only really allusions we have to Germans in this book are quite positive, so that's a shift from what she has done in the past, and is also just interesting given the geopolitical moment that this book is set in. So yeah, that in terms of history, that was pretty much the only things I was really catching, aside from the fact that even though this is apparently like a very updated house, it still like doesn't have central heating. So it's a snow day today. I'm looking out at the snow and I'm thinking, thank God for central heating. That must have been the pits. So anyway, just a couple of historical notes there. And then in terms of like moral development, I honestly didn't find that much. I did think it was I think that this is a very telling book in terms of how Christie thinks about class, or that was one of the things I guess that I got out of this. So if you are paying attention to this in Agatha Christie's work, and I've seen this brought up a few times in the kind of books that I've been reading about her, she very clearly is pretty comfortable with the class system and likes to think of servants as being very happy that they are in the serving class. And I think what's interesting in this particular book, like I think you see that, and then you also are seeing the fact that she does not think that the lower classes should be educated. And apparently from what I've read, she's gonna be increasingly explicit about this, but you can kind of see that even in her works up until now. So I think that is interesting because she always has some level of disdain or kind of mockery towards the aristocracy. Right, like I think you see that in several of her books. Lord Edgeware Dies comes to mind in terms of like a very negative portrayal of the aristocracy as either sort of like evil / maybe gay, or kind of like ugly and dumb. But I think, there's a lot of sort of like kind of airheady aristocrats in Agatha Christie. She doesn't seem to have a very positive attitude towards the aristocracy, but likewise she has a sort of like idealized they're happy in their place idea towards the serving class. So I think she tends to be very smug about her own position in society, which is essentially like non-aristocracy rich people. That tends to be kind of like where her sympathies are most active. So anyway, I think that if you look at some of the like serving class dynamics in this book, that can be a little bit interesting. Especially, I did think it was very interesting to talk about like the perils of being educated above your station. I thought that was interesting. And then in terms of moral development, really the only other kind of thing I thought was interesting or notable is that she introduces the idea of euthanasia, though it's not called that. She introduces this idea very kind of positively in this book, and I'm not really sure what to do with that. Mrs. Wellman is not well. Wellman, not well. She's not well. She's had a series of strokes, and she keeps making kind of joking but not joking references to how she really wants her doctor to help her end her own life. And yeah, again, and he kind of deals with that jokingly. I do think this comes up a couple of other times in her future books, so I don't remember if it's in a Poirot one. But I just thought that was interesting that it's the 30s and this sort of like, I don't know, I think sometimes, I guess it kind of confronted my own ideas about how long that discussion has been going on, which is naive because, I mean, realistically, like, you could look at suicide as a type of euthanasia, and that has been happening since time immemorial, and we've been moralizing about it since time immemorial. But anyway, I just thought that it was interesting that there was sort of an active kind of like thread of the permissibility of being allowed to end your own life because of your body's declining health. And so, yeah, I don't really know what to do with that. Can't really fully judge her attitude, though again, it does seem to be relatively positive in this book. I don't know. And I don't know what my attitude towards it is either, but it just something I thought was interesting and worth kind of noting. But yeah, aside from the fact that this is like a title that is an allusion from Shakespeare, it's from the Twelfth Night, which she does a few times. By the Pricking of My Thumbs comes to mind as a title that she takes from Shakespeare. She's very fond of kind of taking her titles either from like known works of literature or like children's rhymes or things like that. Aside from that, I don't really have a whole lot more to say about this. Like I said, I struggle with how to rank this because I personally didn't necessarily enjoy it that much. I think if I was my enjoyment, I would give it like a 2-star. If I was thinking of it as like a detective novel, I would give it 4. So I'd probably settle on 3. The fact that Poirot isn't in this one very much was always going to ding it down for me. Like I want my Hercule Poirot novels to have a lot of Hercule Poirot. Like that is what I'm coming here for. So I like it better, for instance, in something like Peril at End House. So maybe I'll kind of put it above that. But yeah, I kind of struggle with knowing where to put this one because it really is just sort of like a middle of the road one for me personally, even though I think it's a perfectly fine example of Christie's writing. Aside from the love components, I wasn't wild about that. But that being said, I know that I like next week's a little bit better, which is 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, also known as The Patriotic Murders. I remember really liking that one. We'll see if I like it again. We're in kind of a little stretch of books, like, it's going to be interesting to see how this project goes because I think for the most part we've read most of the really good Christie. There's a few still that I'm gonna really like, but in general, I don't know that there's a ton left that I'm like, oh, I love this one. So it's gonna be interesting to see how the project progresses because I think somewhat you'll see I have less enthusiasm for some of these titles because I'm like, yeah, this one's fine, like it's great, but nothing to write home about really. So yeah, next week is The Patriotic Murder / 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. But that wraps up Sad Cypress. I'm sad that I didn't like it more. Anyway, it's good to be back here on Project Poirot with you guys. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. All that information is listed in the description box below. And I think that will do it. I hope you guys are really having a great day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!